With this being said, let us just quickly go into the discussion. I would like to get your opinion on the fact that it looks like more and more organizations, including the rather traditional ones, and those active in highly regulated industries are shifting to microservices. I would be curious to understand what you think is the major driver behind this move. Shai, maybe you're the one with the microphone not on mute, so maybe you can start.
Yeah, sure. So I think in this area, when looking on the enterprise, it's a bit different because you know, when you're looking on a company like Netflix or like Splunk, and I think even Forbes, is very highly technology company. More traditional organization, it's harder. What I think is part of this. One, there is the new buzzword today, talking about microservice, Kubernetes, containers, all of this, and everyone wants a piece of this. So it's like the new word that came into the market and everyone wants to do that. Second thing, the technology is much more mature in this point of time. It's like when big data was here for a long time and now everybody talking about big data and AI machine learning. It's not new, the technology is ready to handle this. And also the third thing, there is a need from the client and from the landscape and from the worldwide world to run faster, doing things really faster, more agile way. Traditional waterfall will no longer work. Our customers and also our business want result and they want it fast and not something that can be done in few months or few years, sometimes in big projects. So all of these are pushing us into the microservice world.
Okay, good. What also the opinion of the others? So maybe Abby, Stephen.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to agility. It's much easier to deploy. You have a lot more independence, and you know the ability to actually kind of separate your monolith into a lot of different teams gives everybody the chance to kind of run forward a little faster. And even decoupling from the monolith has team benefits too. Most teams find that the dev time is reduced and that their code is more reusable. And it's also nice to be able to run your microservices on smaller machines or containers. So there's just a ton of benefits that just make it a lot easier to adopt the microservice model.
Okay, good.
Totally agree.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think that that you know, with the pace of technology and these new platforms and runtimes are evolving, I think transitioning over to microservices is like a unique opportunity to be able to try out new architectures and new technologies. Whereas if you were, you know, dealing with exclusively monolithic applications, you kind of have to upgrade or re-platform a whole huge thing all at once. But you know, that's a lift that almost nobody would be willing to take on. But with microservices, you can kind of write this one thing on you know, some cutting edge, new promising technology, see how it goes, maybe migrate something else over, or maybe, you know, by that time there's something even better. So I think it gives you an opportunity to kind of evolve with the technology. I think that's one of the really, really nice features of going towards microservices.
Okay, thank you. And also maybe I can take the opportunity now and ask also the audience to come up with questions. I think this is a fairly open format. So if you guys have questions for the panelists, just drop them here in the Q&A button, and we'll make sure we address them. All right, so thank you for the answers here. When it comes to transition from monolith, what would you say is something to be carefully observed along the journey? And what would be some very classical pitfalls or challenges that occur when transitioning from monolith to microservices?
I think one of the biggest ones that I've seen is trying to do too much at one time. When you try to turn a monolith into a series of microservices, it's really rare that, you know, the people that are working on it have all the experience with that monolith. It's usually something that was built up over many, many years. And so trying to do it all at once can be a little bit daunting, and you can miss the details that were, you know, maybe hidden in the code in some obscure place by somebody who no longer works at the company. So it's a bit ambitious. I usually would stay away from trying to rewrite monoliths and microservices like as a wholesale project, and just try to break pieces off one at a time, get things working that way, and do it piecemeal.
So I think that one pitfall that that you can run into maybe a little bit further down the line is the criticality of your services. So it's really a lot easier to accidentally create critical services that you aren't expecting to be critical. Because of the additional complexity, it can be difficult to make sure that your non-critical service really is non-critical. So if you don't know that your service has become critical, you can accidentally cause production problems, and you know, if your service experiences issues. So I think that's one of the things that is important, is just to make sure that you have good testing and good observability to be able to make sure that you know that how your particular service will affect the overall system.
Yeah, we actually see that quite a bit when you know, a microservice is kind of developed and doesn't have maybe the monitoring or the alerting mechanisms that another one does. Like maybe it's not as, maybe it's newer, or just not as built out, not as much rigor, or, you know, somebody didn't think it was as important, but it becomes important, and then, you know, the monitoring and alerting isn't quite there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's pretty easy to actually accidentally create these links that you don't really mean to create, and then something happens and you're affecting prod and nobody really knows why. And I think that's really what it is that like things are far more complex. And even though you get all these great benefits of agility and being able to be independent, you have to remember that this is all part of one big machine, and understanding how your service plays a role, and that like that might change any deployment that you make, any code change that you make might change its role. So it's very important to be observing that and how it's interacting with the environment.
Yeah, for example, one of the pitfalls for this, I totally agree with you guys, that some organization or teams just run in and say, let's do microservice, it's good buzzword, let's run. And we must do very, very careful planning for this. For example, what infrastructure we're going to use, what kind of development we are going to use, not to now start and create too many development languages and too many development stack for this. What is the architecture for this? Like you said, logs, like secret, like configuration, a lot of things. And the basic that I think is proper infrastructure and a proper CI/CD in agile approach for this, because very soon you can have hundreds of microservices, and if it's not proper proper CI/CD and proper DevOps behind this, so you can get into very big teams that just handling microservices. And this is, you miss the point in some way.
Yeah, and I think it makes it much harder to learn from each other if everybody's kind of off on their own path. Everyone's using a different architecture, different language, different infrastructure, different DevOps patterns. It makes it really difficult as you learn and grow and start to become used to this new microservice architecture. If everyone's doing something different, you can't really learn from each other very easily.
Yeah,
all right.
Find microservices that are like monolith at the end.
Yeah. I have actually a question coming from the audience that I think would be the right time to address, and that is, were you able to reasonably define the rule of thumb when you divide service into multiple versus keeping it as single service?
That's a good question. I would say no. I don't think there is a rule of thumb that you could apply. I think it's always in the details. So, you know, I think you have to take a careful look at the application and why you would be moving it into a microservice, and then go from there. I would be wary of any overly broad rule of thumb.
All right.
The only advice that I can think about it, but agree with Stefan. I try to find the bottleneck on the specific places that are the problematic and maybe start from there. But it's in the details. The devil and also the solution is always in the details.
Okay. Good. Thank you. And another question also coming from the audience, how do you manage the added complexity that the microservice architecture inherently brings? And perhaps that we can also later on develop based on this.
So I think one of the things that you can do is create an environment where you can figure out how it's safe to learn. Using practices like game days, trying to use chaos engineering practices, doing reactive or proactive approaches to trying to understand how your service will respond to different things helps you understand how to navigate all that complexity. Also, I think making sure that you have really sound monitoring, logging, any observability practices that you can employ, and then on top of that, good deployment practices will all help navigate the complexity and make it a little bit easier.
All right, just a quick one, because I also noticed that Andy Man joined. So Andy, very good morning. Great to have you here.
Morning. Oh, I missed the time zone. My goodness gracious me. I'm glad I at least made it in time to catch the trail end. Hi, Claudio. How you doing?
All right. All right. We were just talking briefly about how you guys manage the added complexity of that microservices architecture inherently bring. That was the topic right now.
That's actually a topic of great interest to me. You know, I mean, I think what Amy was saying about game days is really important. You know, in general, the way that we see people handling microservices, the complexity is using data. It's so complex. Interconnections, you said it yourself, it's necessarily more complex because of the more interconnections, more processes talking to each other. Using data is the way that we see our customers being able to handle that speed, the velocity, the complexity, the variety, and the volume of data in those microservice architectures.
All right, thank you, thank you. I think Shay, you were also about to say something. Sorry.
No, that's background noise.
All right, good. Well, based on what we discussed so far, moving to microservices brings a lot of changes also internally for you, for the organization itself. And I was curious to hear a few thoughts on what does it take to change the working mindset and to adapt the organization from a monolithic approach to using microservices.
Let me just jump in. I'll start. So certainly the digital speed and scale, as I said, means that one of the big things moving from that monolith to the microservice environment, the agility of the microservice and the multiple interconnects, the trace data between them, all of the activity within the microservices, and especially when you start to think about using third-party services as well. Again, using data-driven systems for delivery as well as for managing and securing those systems. This is a mindset change. You can't hug everything. In a monolith, you could see and hug everything. You could manage your own systems. I think developers much more, their mindset much more capable of this abstraction, with operations and security teams much more used to being able to see and hold and own their own systems. So being able to let go and understand that you can manage through abstraction and manage through data, just that mindset, I think, is a really important start to moving from that monolith into the microservice.
I would say too, I think it's really important to give people a place to try things out. I think, like, saying, hey, we're going to move everything overnight. It's kind of, I can't remember if it was Shay or Steven that said, like, take it in small bites, because it can become overwhelming very quickly. But giving people a place to try things out and giving them a little bit of space to learn is really important as well.
Also, we don't need to move to microservice just because there is a new thing microservice. We need to do it only when it's necessary and only where it gives value. So only to systems that need to be very agile and very flexible. So this is the place that you should tackle it, but not just say, let's take this kind of application that's running for 10 years because it's a monolith and let's move it. It must be business value out of it as something. We need to do it for some reason, not just because it's a cool technology stuff to do. Otherwise it will fail.
Okay, so I understand this is kind of a journey, and you cannot do it overnight. But that perhaps involves also new processes, new data sources for you, perhaps even new tools. How do you put all this puzzle together for the new reality that you'll be onboarding?
I mean, I think it helps to kind of understand, like, stepping back, what do you need to be successful here? What are the best practices that we want to try to promote and employ? Do we have the right observability in place? What is our security models? And you're not trying to create a bunch of process to make red tape. Like, I hate red tape. It's really about making things easier for people so that they don't have to worry about some of the things that are on the periphery, and they can really concentrate on the actual piece that they're responsible for.
And just keying off that, Amy, the observability we're finding is absolutely key. It's a growing area of focus for us and for our customers. This idea that you need to change the way your system reports itself. Historically, the monolith, we've used these fake it techniques with synthetics and bytecode instrumentation and these sorts of synthetic and pretend ways of looking at it. But with microservice, we have the opportunity for the microservice to actually do semantic logging and report its own status so that you can observe every single activity within it. So I'm a big fan of this idea that you don't sample individual data sets. You take all the data, because one data point could be enough to show you a performance problem, a security breach, a customer being dissatisfied. So this idea of being able to look at all the data, but also this necessarily being able to get the application to be observable, to have that property where it tells you what's going on, gives you insight, not just into the system performance and the security of that service, but also into the payload, the activity. What is your customer doing, and whether that's a good thing and whether you can make it better or not.
Yeah, and it's take you back to I think, to very detailed and the importance of the good architecture design, because as Amy said, when we start before, when you're doing a monolith application, so you have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 source of logs, and this is very easy to find if something go wrong, also for developers. When you go to microservices, and for very big microservices with 20 and 100 different pieces running, and something went wrong, so now it's become very, very hard to find it. So this is why we need a very good data strategy. What kind of logs are going to save, how they're going to be saved, maybe not in the same place, but how you're going to manage this, so that you will be able to observe, and you have good observability what is happening.
And the other thing too is you can grow from observability. Once you've got great observability in place, that's a great situation to start having opportunities to experiment. And even simple things like putting a canary process in place is so much easier in a microservice environment than it ever would have been in a monolith. And so, starting out with your best practices, and then all of the pieces that you need to build up, you can get into these situations where you're creating an environment that is actually much easier and safer, even though it's far more complex.
Okay. A comment from the audience. Perhaps you could give a quick feedback. Does it make sense to define any general guidelines, such as hardware limits or others, as part of the migration from monoliths to microservices, to make sure similar granularity is used across the enterprise?
I can only think it's very differ between organization and organization, system to system, but I can only think that the architecture or the infrastructure or the team that's responsible for this kind of activity in organizations should create the blueprint and should create the basic guideline. So what system, what infrastructure, what you're going to use, how it's going to be used, lay out this foundation, and the other organization and the other teams in the organization should reuse it. So it's a general response because it's differ from organization to organization, from the security requests of each organization, from the who are the users of each organization. It's hard to answer these details.
All right. Teva, were you just about to say something before, or?
Yeah, I think when you consider hardware requirements of monoliths and moving to microservices, they're so drastically different, and that's one of the main reasons you might switch to a microservice architecture. So when you have a monolith that's trying to do too many things, or maybe it's doing all the things, you potentially have like a flow in some area of the application that requires a ton of CPU, maybe it's a ton of memory, and then you have a bunch of flows that don't require that. So when you go to a microservice architecture, one of the big benefits of doing that is you can fine tune the microservices hardware to suit that flow more precisely. So you won't be wasting resources for something that doesn't need them, for example, and you can scale more effectively as a result.
All right, thank you. Another question from the audience. How do you migrate the governance and documentation between the two worlds?
I'll just jump in with a couple of ideas from my experience. Yeah, when I've worked on this idea around DocOps. We've all heard DevOps and all of the Asta Ops, and bottom line, they all seem to translate into some sort of agile collaboration, right? So DevSecOps, agile collaboration with Dev and Sec and Ops. DocOps, I don't love the word, but it's essentially a collaboration between development and technical writers. And it's an open way of using sort of wiki-based and essentially open source style of documentation, so that the developer can work on it and simultaneously tech writers can work on it. It's agile. By the way, you can also get operations, SRE, and sort of recovery teams to add their own ideas into the documentation as well, in terms of operations, manageability, the governance requirements, what you do in a microservice environment. That's a whole new kettle of fish. But one way is that idea of DocOps, and other people have written about this. And it's essentially just agile collaboration between the various players in this environment. The old monolith, you could throw things over the fence in a waterfall way, but with microservices so well attached to agile development and site reliability engineering techniques, it has to be that collaborative thing. And I firmly believe in bringing more and more teams into that collaborative workflow to deliver and manage systems and services.
Okay, good. Would anyone else have something to add here?
I mean, just building off of what Andy said, like I do think it has to be a collaborative approach. We, as much independence and decoupling as you get from microservices, you also have to work together to make this big system work with many more cogs than it used to have. And so whatever you're doing, it can't be independent. You can't have, a team wiki that talks just about your thing and doesn't connect it to the larger system. So while I've never had any experience with what Andy was mentioning, I'm actually very interested in that, because I do think that the more collaborative you can get with this, and the more you can have people that are actually good at these things helping tie the whole thing together, the better, the more successful you're going to be.
Okay, good. Thank you for the. I don't know, Andy, if you feel like commenting something now further on this. Otherwise, perhaps we can look a bit at architectures and how can the architecture on one hand support, but also pose a risk for both the organization as well as the users of the product. I have the feeling that there are lots of myths behind this, but there is also some cruel reality. So maybe you can help everyone with a bit of clarity here when it comes to architecture. What are the preferred approaches? Shai, maybe, or Amy, or
yeah, I can find this. I think that there is let's say the basic pattern of the MSA, the microservice architecture principle, and the way of touching things, and how to go and decoupling different area or different services into according to, for example, what is the bottleneck, what is being exposed more or less, how you implement security. So I think the architecture in the microservice, I see it as, if not the most, so one of the most important phases when planning and implementing microservice solution on anything, because this is where you sit in design and plan. I saw it also in the past and see it in other places, that when you are not doing proper architecture design, for stuff, even easy stuff like what you're going to do with the logs, how you're going to make all the API talk one to each other, if you are going to do change on the database level or not, what is if database is a monolith database, decoupling database, how are you going to handle this? So I think the architecture is very important, and it's very it's not something that is risk for the microservice.
Yeah, absolutely, Shai. And I just add, you make me think of automation and orchestration lets you do things at speed, which is good if you're doing good things, but also bad if you're doing bad things. Microservice architectures typically will need significant amounts of orchestration and automation because they are lots and lots of smaller moving parts that you need to put together. And so the old monolith would just sit there by itself static. The microservice is very dynamic. So it's very easy for things to get out of control. I'm not just talking about things like race conditions within code, but I'm also talking about automation doing sort of some unchecked things. A race condition on provisioning, for example. All of a sudden you provisioned 100,000 servers for your containers, if you will, for an application that didn't necessarily need all that. So managing all that automation and managing scale in as well as scale out, right? Because one of the beauties of microservices is they handle load cycles really well. You can scale out really quickly, deal with your peak loads, shopping time, Christmas time, right where we're at now. But you want to save money and save resource, so scaling back in. So managing that automation, it's a different mindset. Again, back to what you were saying before, Claudio, that different mindset from the monolith to the microservice.
Okay, yeah. Stephen?
Shai touched on something I think is really important with this. Is the database? Are you breaking it apart? Are you kind of using multiple databases, or are you kind of using the same one for all your services? And coming from a monolith, you might not you might overlook that. But I think a monolith, you typically have like one database, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the case with microservices. So you need to evaluate, should I even be using the same database for all these different services, or is there something more appropriate for each individual one? And you know, at points of IO, you know, where all these services could be reaching into like the same kind of the same system, and there are performance considerations there and scaling considerations that are extremely important. I think actually that's usually where I see systems kind of hitting performance bottlenecks, is at those IO points with the database or a message bus or something like that. So it needs to be carefully considered.
And Claudio, you mentioned myths as well. Let me give you a couple of myths. A lot of people think cloud is inherently insecure, right? Because other people are running my stuff. Nothing could be further than truth. A lot of cloud providers will give you better security than your own internal people just because they're dedicated to it. So do understand that just because you're going to a microservice architecture doesn't inherently add risk. Another of the myth is that microservices expose more attack vectors, and they probably do, but your biggest threat is still insiders. Your biggest threat from a security perspective is still accidental exposure from one of your privileged internal users. So we all worry about hackers and crackers and external black hats and stuff like that. Yes, be worried about that. But what you really need to manage is those internal processes, right? There's no such thing as human error. It's all system error. And so managing those processes that let people do things fast, maliciously, accidentally, that's going to be the biggest problem in terms of security and governance. Although external attackers are an issue, insider threat is still the biggest threat you've got in your business.
All right, but then speaking of security, are there any how should I say, proved paths to ensure security microservices, or are there any particular models to be followed? And of course, what about the external business partners that you're working for, ranging from starting, of course, with the cloud provider and also going beyond that?
So, I mean, I think one thing I would just say is just make it as easy as possible for teams to adopt centralized security practices. You know, as much as you can. These are things that are difficult. It can be hard to do the right thing if left to your own devices. So just make it easier for people by having a centralized security practice that they can just adopt. And then for that centralized security process, or practice, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot out there that solves many problems. And you know, the more that you can kind of learn from other people and other architectures and other tools and figure out what you need and what works for you, without sort of stepping back and trying to figure it out all from scratch, I think the faster and more secure you're going to get. And the easier it is going to be to create a centralized security practice that other people can easily use.
Yeah, I can't applaud enough, Amy. The idea of connecting data from multiple sections and departments and teams and services is so important. It just takes one gap for the malicious actors to get into that workflow. I can't applaud that enough. The other thing that I would say is that there is no real identity, right? You've got to have constant understanding of identity. With a monolith, you'd have long-running transactions within that monolith. So your identity, your authorization, your authentications had all been predefined. With microservices, this is all dynamic. So you need to be able to dynamically deal with identity. And I would say that a lot of security practice in a microservice architecture is more about anomaly detection and behavioral analysis. What is normal versus what is abnormal, rather than what is authorized versus what is unauthorized. So security architectures take on a very different mode, this idea that there is no perimeter, that identity must be continually reinforced, that security is a constant function, not a one-time call. Yeah, this is a very different approach to security in a microservice environment.
Yeah, exactly. And also it take you, I think it's the first time I say it take you back to the design phase. For example, because you have so many different parts that are running all over your organization that need to talk to each other. So you need to make sure that the right firewall are in place between different layers, that they are talking, if it's HTTPS or whatever, or if it's a batch, or what is the way that they are talking between each other to make sure that they are connected correctly, all the managing the secrets on the authorization, authentication, making sure that you put the security in place. And also in big enterprise organizations that are not advanced technology organization, the security department is less 1 or 2 steps behind the technology. And it taking more time to get into this area and understand exactly how to protect this microservice, and it will come. And as a developer and as a technology, you know what is the best practice for security. So put them in start instead of fixing it later on.
Okay, thank you. We still have 2-3 more questions and only 4 or 5 minutes left. But I hope it's fine for you if we go through all of them. So I would go quickly now to scalability of microservices. What are the approaches to segregate across various servers? How do you ensure optimal performance for the app when obviously what you said there, you have peaks like Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter, some big situations like this? How do you move forward and adopt basically a single model? If you can tell me a bit more about this. Andy, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I don't want to dominate. I know that, some of the things that I look at performance a lot. This is where I couldn't be more happy when Amy brought up observability earlier on. This is, and just, I'm not sure if it's been described, the idea that observability is a property of a system. It's the system makes itself observable. You can see what's happening. Think about in an industrial environment, which is where this term comes from. Inside a water pipe, for example, in a factory, you can't see inside the pipe. So what you do is you put telemetry in, you put a flow valve or maybe a purity sensor or something like that. And so now I can tell what's happening inside the pipe. This is observability. In microservices, we do this by doing things like semantic logging and metrics emission out of our application. And so this is how you guarantee performance, is you write performance into the system. I talked about agility, agile development, and DevOps earlier on. So the idea that your microservice is not production ready until your SRE team has approved it to be operable. Right? So they understand what signals they're looking for a good performance. What does it look like to have good performance and good user experience? And again, using that anomaly detection and data-driven responses to understand what is deviation from normal. So using ML, things like AI ops is a new area. We're looking at applying machine learning to understand these data patterns to know what's good service versus what's bad service, so you can react to that.
Okay, thank you. Shai, Amy, Stefan, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I think that there are a few things to consider here. The scalability of the application itself, it has a tight connection with how you configure your scaling at the infrastructure level. So for example, if you're writing a Python app, maybe you might have configured a certain number of processes or concurrency that it can handle per pod. And then you need to consider that in conjunction with how your horizontal pod autoscaler is set up and what are your minimums and maximums there. Otherwise, you might not get the concurrency you're expecting. You could be overly reliant on pod scaling to do your scaling when really you need like application scaling or vice versa. And it's a bit dependent on the language, I think, what you can do and what strings you can pull to get the scaling that you want. So I think that's worth considering in every application individually. Also, startup time of the application is really important, especially with horizontal pod auto scaling. I think somebody else mentioned this earlier, but in one of the presentations actually. But yeah, if you have an application that takes a minute or two to start up, that's not going to scale horizontally very well, because when you hit that spike, if there's a sale on your website or what have you, and Kubernetes or something goes to scale up your application, and all these new pods are taking too long to start, you're going to have perhaps more problems than you started out with, because it's going to keep trying to scale. You're going to get like the pods will be thrashing, and it's not going to be good. So you need to consider how the application handles the scale up.
All right, thank you. Second last question for you guys. Microservices maturity level. What do you actually need to do to make sure you reach resilience of the services? What are the preemptive steps for building up a strong maturity level?
I mean, I think we talked about a lot of these things already, but making sure that you have your best practices, observability is really important. And I think both Andy and I have mentioned how you can build off of observability, bringing in experimentation, AI ops, data science, machine learning, like all of these things start to kind of grow out. And I think that in order to make sure that you have a really healthy system that you can build on, you really need to start with sort of that observability model, security model, and making sure that you're giving your teams a way to learn and build off of the knowledge that they have collectively, not just independently.
I want to add to this. What I think is, if I will take only two main important things from my side when going to microservice, because since it's a big shift in the way you work and the way you think and the way you implement. So the two things that I think, one is a very strong DevOps capabilities to support the scale of microservice. And the second is an agile way of work, agile way of development, and bring the people that you work with them have the agile concept and the way they are working. And this is I think the base for starting.
Yeah, I love that, Shai. Continuous everything is sort of my mantra, from development, from planning through development, testing, integration, deployment, those feedback loops, the security, because everything is small, it iterates very quickly. And so this continuous loop, this continuous cycle is absolutely critical. I love that, Shai. The other thing I would say is just the idea of scaling up your ability to turn data into action. And so you start with by automating known knowns, right? The automated response for a known issue. You can then start to use data to start to get ahead of the curve. You know what causes issues, so you can start to recognize those patterns and predict them. So this, you can deal with unknown knowns through predictive analytics. And then taking data-driven response for when you've got what I would call a known unknown, like an unexpected peak. You know it's going to happen eventually, you just don't know when it's going to happen, using data and patterns to be able to define how to deal with that. And then you can get really advanced as you go forward to deal with novel problems by using things like Amy was talking about, that machine learning. Game days, Amy was talking about, is again trying out new ways of working, new routines, new functions, feature flagging and stuff like that. And then you can start to really ramp up the experimentation, the innovation by doing those sorts of things. I love the way that you approach that, Amy, that idea of making time for innovation it's such a big benefit of microservices.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andy, you actually said something that sparked something that I forgot to mention. I think that as we've matured, we really start to think about how to make things easier for our developers, because the complexity becomes so overwhelming to them without having the proper things in place. And you mentioned continuous everything. And one of the things that I think is really important as you mature your model is we're trying to get from development to production with the least pain possible. And so, my world is really centered on continuous integration, continuous development, and continuous experimentation. So I've got the middle of that layer, but all of these pieces need to work together well in order to make it so that your developers are spending time where they really should be spending time, and not on trying to fiddle with the machine to make it work the way they want it to.
Okay, well, thank you. With this being said, I have one last question for you guys. I'm really curious about your thoughts on what can we expect from 2021 in terms of innovation trends to be seen in the microservices field.
So
I can, sorry.
No, go ahead, Shay.
No, it's okay.
So I think the big focus that I've started to see is really on intent-based everything, making sure that all of our configuration is intent-based and that we're managing more for people. Providing more managed experiences is something that we're really focused on. And again, that goes back to that that idea of continuous everything. Where we're really trying to say, don't worry, we've actually got defaults for you. They're sane, and here you go. Here's getting from I've committed all the way to production without you having to stress out about it as much. And really a lot of that is focused on, changing to intent-based everything.
What I can add for this, because it's looking forward, it's my opinion, what I think. One, I think people will get to know that microservices is definitely not to everybody, and not all the things need to be microservice implementation on them. I also think that there will be I would call it the rise of nanoservices. So it will be even smaller than microservices and starting to go more and more to function level and to do it even smaller. I know that Google has something already in pipe that is working, but I think it will be more and more continuous. And the two other things, one is increased security, because I currently think that microservices is not secure enough and there is not enough good enough solutions on the shelf for security, the microservices. And I think this will get a very big push during the next year. And the second thing is all the AI and automation and all. We talk about it in this session. There is tons of data that's been created out of those microservices, and what to do with this data, and put AI and machine learning behind this to make something out of this.
100% on all of that, Shay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking of the ideas of continuous security, this idea of applying that security layer, the substrate, from all the way from planning through dev and test and into operations and that feedback loop. I see microservices extending beyond the centralized cloud, extending to the edge, perhaps to IoT. This idea of MSA turf wars. There'll be consolidation. There's always consolidation in new environments, new industries. We already see some of that happening in some of the vendor landscape. I think there's going to be some kind of return to an ESB kind of style. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, by the way. I think there's a natural aversion to this idea of randomness and entropy that microservices appear to be. And there's a natural desire to corral things back into a controlled structure. And I think we'll see people start to layer controls and sort of enterprise service bus kind of architectures on top of microservices to try and create a flexible monolith or something. I don't know that that's going to be a good thing, but I think it'll happen. The last thing I'll say is open standards will become much more important. Customers, we're seeing a lot of our customers ask us to get open in every way. Interconnection with microservice becomes so much more important. Interconnection, not just between teams, between departments, but between companies. And so being able to have an open standard way of having interconnects, open standards for things like monitoring, things like open telemetry to be able to understand that observability layer, regardless of what service you're getting it from. I think the open standards growth will be really important in the growth of microservices through the next year or two.
All right. Well, I think these are pretty much the questions that I had in store here, and also the time is not really working on our favor. It really flew, but that's also a good sign that this was a very dynamic, vivid discussion. So perhaps I would now give the floor to each of you for some closing remarks on the microservices, on how you feel about it. Just 2-3 words, and then we will wrap it up. Since Shai is with the microphone open, then let's start with you.
Okay, I didn't mute it from the start. I will tell you what I think. Microservices, I see it as a window for all the containers in Kubernetes, and basically, this is where we are going. We are going to all this area of container Kubernetes. From old computer centers into VM and data centers, and now one computer is going to be the next generation data center. So this is where we are going, and it's not a trend. It's something that's going more and more and more, and it's going to exceed over the coming years.
Thank you, Shai. Amy?
It's not as hard as it seems. It's a big change, and it's a lot to learn. But there's a lot of people that are there putting out a lot of information on how to make it easier. So try to chunk it down, take one bite at a time, and you'll get there.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I would say that if you're at all intimidated by microservices and having like too many things to manage, I encourage you to take a look at some of the newer serverless platforms that you can create microservices on. It takes a lot of the operational overhead out of it, and so you can trade kind of the complexity of managing your own like scaling and control plane and monitoring and stuff like that. You can kind of trade that for microservice architecture where you may have more services, but each service has like less individual parts in and of itself.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Yeah, look, I'll just add, I'll just reiterate, bring data to everything, right? Every decision, every action. Microservices get too complex for human scale management. They're too fast, the volume, variety, velocity of activity that's happening within them, the interconnects, the communications happening between them. This is literally too hard once you get to a certain scale to be able to manage with human minds and brains. Machines do data analytics really, really well. Let your people do innovation, creativity, try out new things. Let the machine deal with the day-to-day, figuring out what's good, what's bad, what's safe, what's not safe. Use data for all of this where you can. Feed your automation with data and free up your people to do the innovative creativity work.
Excellent. Once again, thank you all for taking the time to join this discussion. I truly believe this was a really inspiring hour spent here discussing about microservices. So many thanks for sharing your thoughts.